I knew the conversation was different before she even spoke. Not because of the words, because of the pause that came before them. At my age, pauses matter. They usually mean someone has already decided something and is now choosing how gently to say it. The kind of pause that tells you this isn't about today. It's about what holds your days together. If you're around my age, you know the feeling. That quiet tightening in your chest when a routine meeting suddenly feels heavier than it should. When you realize this isn't just another conversation, it's a shift, and you don't yet know how far it goes. She sat across from me, calm, professional, composed. No raised voice. No warning signs. Just a careful breath. Then she said it. Let's talk about a small change. My name is David. I'm 65 years old. And, until that moment, I believed I still understood how my working life was going to end. For more than 40 years, work had been the one thing that stayed predictable. You showed up. You solved problems. You earned your place quietly. I'd watched systems change, software replace instincts, younger people arrive with new ideas and faster reflexes. I adapted. I didn't complain. I stayed useful. That sentence, small change, didn't sound dangerous. Not on its own. But I knew better than to judge it by the words. At my age, you learn to listen for what isn't being said. There was no timeline. No reassurance. No explanation. Just enough space for your mind to start filling in possibilities you didn't want to consider. I felt the urge to interrupt immediately. To ask what kind of change. To defend myself before I needed defending. To list years, results, numbers, loyalty. All the things you hope still count. I didn't. I knew not to interrupt. Silence isn't weakness when you've lived long enough. Silence is how you buy time. How you hear what's underneath the language people are trained to use. She continued, explaining that the company was reviewing roles. That phrase had been circulating for months. Roles. Not people. Not lives. Roles. She talked about alignment, future needs, and transitions. Her voice stayed even, almost careful, like she was walking across thin ice she didn't want to crack. While she spoke, my attention drifted to small, ordinary details. The way her hands rested on a folder she hadn't opened yet. The quiet hum of the building. The routine I'd built over decades without realizing how much of my life it was holding together. That routine was being touched now. Lightly. The way you touch something fragile when you're deciding whether to move it or let it go. That was my first real choice, even if she didn't know it. I could push back, anchor the conversation in my past contributions, and try to force clarity too early. Or I could listen long enough to understand what kind of future they were imagining for me, whether I agreed with it or not. I chose to listen. When she stopped speaking, there was another pause. The one where you're expected to respond. I looked at the folder again. Still closed. That told me everything I needed to know. The details weren't ready yet. The direction was. I nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. Driving home later, I replayed the meeting the way you replay moments that don't feel finished. Nothing had been decided. No one had said the word end. And yet something fundamental had shifted. At 65, you understand how rarely things reverse once they start moving quietly. At home, I sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. The house was calm in the way it gets when you live alone long enough. Not lonely, just settled. I thought about how lightly the word change is used by people who don't feel its weight. I thought about how close you can be to the end of something without anyone naming it. That evening, I asked myself a question I hadn't expected to face so clearly. When the moment comes, and it will, do I want to be managed out politely, or do I want to understand my options before they're narrowed for me? The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of calm and tension. Calm, because nothing had been taken from me yet. Tension, because the silence meant the decision wasn't over. It was simply happening somewhere else. That's the truth no one prepares you for. The most important moments in later life don't arrive with announcements. They arrive with careful smiles and phrases that sound harmless. As I left for work again, one thought stayed with me. This wasn't about losing a job. It was about whether I would let someone else decide when my usefulness ended. And once that question enters your life, it doesn't leave quietly. The second time I noticed her, it wasn't in her office. It was in the hallway, early in the morning, before most people arrived. She was standing by the window with a paper cup of coffee, looking outside instead of at her phone. That's not something people in her position usually do. They're usually already preparing for the next conversation, the next decision. She looked still, almost tired. That's when I realized something important. She hadn't slept well either. I didn't stop to talk to her. I just walked past, nodded once, and kept going. But that image stayed with me longer than it should have. Because it didn't fit the version of her I'd built in my head after our meeting. In my mind, she was the messenger. Calm, controlled, unaffected. Seeing her like that cracked that image just enough to let doubt in. All day, I worked the way I always had. Carefully, quietly. I answered questions from younger guys who assumed I'd always be there. I fixed a problem on a machine that kept stalling because someone had trusted a software update more than experience. No one thanked me. No one needed to. That's how it's been for years. Being useful without being visible. But underneath it all, there was a low, constant awareness. The kind that doesn't distract you, but doesn't leave either. Every task felt slightly provisional. Like it might be one of the last times I was doing it this way. Later that afternoon, she stopped by my area. Not officially. No folder. No prepared tone. Just her, standing a few feet away, hands loosely folded. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. I did. I always do. That's part of the problem. We walked to the break room. It was empty, the way it gets when everyone's schedules no longer line up naturally. She leaned against the counter instead of sitting. Another small detail. People lean when they don't plan to stay long, or when they're unsure how the conversation will go. She didn't start with policy. She didn't say anything about changes or reviews. Instead, she said, "I wanted you to know, yesterday wasn't easy for me." That caught me off guard. Not because I expected her to be cold, but because I hadn't expected honesty. Not that early. I didn't say anything. I waited. Silence again. It's funny how often silence becomes the most useful tool you have. My father, she continued, worked for the same company for 32 years. Different industry. Same ending. She smiled briefly, but it didn't reach her eyes. They told him it was time to transition, that he should be proud. He wasn't. I nodded. Not in agreement. In recognition. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was explaining herself. Or maybe explaining why she hadn't opened the folder yet. That's when I felt my second real choice approaching. I could keep my distance, treat this as a professional courtesy that meant nothing. Or I could acknowledge that this wasn't just a process unfolding. It was two people standing on different sides of the same moment. I chose the safer option. Or so I thought. "I understand," I said. 2 words. Enough to close the space between us just slightly. Not enough to invite promises. She exhaled almost imperceptibly. "I wanted you to hear that from me. Not as part of anything official." We didn't talk much after that. She left first. I stayed behind, staring at the coffee machine that never quite worked the way it should. I wondered if this conversation was meant to reassure me, or herself. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention. Not to what she said, but to what she did. She delayed follow-ups. She asked questions instead of issuing instructions. She listened more than she spoke. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, almost invisible adjustments. The kind you only notice when you're already on edge. And that's where the doubt crept in. Was she trying to help me? Or was this just how the system softened the edges before it moved on? At 65, you learn not to confuse kindness with protection. One doesn't always come with the other. Still, something shifted. I stopped seeing her as just a role. She became a person who had seen this story end badly before and didn't want to repeat it if she didn't have to. That didn't make her powerful, but it made her human. That night, lying awake longer than usual, I faced another question. If the opportunity came to shape what happened next, would I take it? Or would I stay quiet? hoping silence would somehow preserve what time had already begun to loosen. There's comfort in doing nothing. There's safety in waiting. But there's also risk in letting decisions be made without you. By the end of that week, I understood something clearly. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be decided in one meeting. It would be decided in moments like this, unofficial, unscheduled, easy to misread. And the real danger wasn't that I might be pushed out. The real danger was that I might stay still long enough for that decision to be made for me. The first time I saw my name highlighted in red, I didn't recognize myself. It was on a screen at the front of the room, projected bigger than any version of me I'd ever known. Rows of numbers, columns of titles. And there it was, my position, my department, my cost, boxed and marked as something that needed attention. No one said my name out loud. They didn't have to. If you've spent enough years in one place, you learn how danger shows up without knocking. It arrives quietly, wrapped in charts and neutral language. It doesn't accuse you. It simply points. The meeting went on as if nothing unusual had happened. The new operations director spoke confidently about margins, efficiency, and future-proofing. Words like streamlining and rebalancing floated through the room. Around me, people nodded, took notes, checked their phones. A few glanced in my direction, then quickly away, like they hadn't meant to see anything at all. I sat still. That's another thing age teaches you. Movement draws attention. Stillness lets you observe. When the meeting ended, conversations resumed immediately. Someone joked about how long it would take before the next reorganization. Another talked about a bonus tied to cost savings. A younger engineer passed by me and said, half smiling, "If I had your benefits, I'd retire tomorrow." He didn't mean harm. He didn't understand the math behind that sentence. How benefits aren't just numbers. They're the scaffolding holding the rest of your life upright. I went back to my area and did what I always do. I worked. But something had changed. Every task felt exposed, as if I were performing under an invisible timer. I caught myself wondering whether someone was watching, not to learn, but to measure. Not to understand, but to decide. By midday, I knew I couldn't let it sit. Silence had served me well so far, but silence has limits. There's a point where it stops being strategic and starts becoming surrender. So I made a decision that scared me more than staying quiet ever had. I asked to speak with her. She didn't make me wait. That surprised me. When I walked into her office, the folder was open this time. Papers neatly aligned. The conversation had moved closer to the surface. I didn't start by defending myself. I didn't talk about years or loyalty or past contributions. Instead, I said something that felt dangerous in its honesty. I don't want to disappear, I told her. I want to transition on my feet. She listened without interrupting. No notes. No glances at the clock. I laid out what I had been thinking about for days. Not demands. A proposal. A mentoring plan. A defined period where I would train 2 younger engineers, document what couldn't be found online, and stay available during critical runs. Not forever. Long enough to leave things stronger than I found them. When I finished, there was a pause. A different kind this time. This would be unconventional, she said carefully. I'm aware, I replied. But it's honest. She didn't promise anything. She said she'd bring it forward. That was all. A few days later, the answer came. Not directly from her. From the system. They agreed partially. The mentoring would happen. The knowledge transfer mattered. But my hours would be reduced. My role reclassified. Benefits adjusted accordingly. Not punishment. Just alignment. It was framed as a compromise. And, in many ways, it was. I walked out of that conversation carrying 2 truths at once. I had avoided being erased quietly. And I had stepped closer to the edge I'd been trying not to see. That afternoon, I stood by my truck longer than usual before driving home. I watched younger employees leave laughing, talking about weekend plans. I wondered how many of them had ever seen their name turn red on a screen. That night, sleep came slowly. I thought about pride, about fear, about the thin line between choosing your exit and being grateful for being allowed to stay a little longer. Here was my next choice, heavier than the last. Accept the partial win and adjust my life around it. Or push further and risk becoming what the charts already hinted at. Too costly, too complicated, too visible. In the end, I realized something uncomfortable but clear. The system hadn't decided my worth, but it had decided my price. And now, I had to decide whether that was something I could live with, or something I needed to challenge before time made the decision for me. The morning I almost signed the retirement form, it wasn't fear that stopped me. It was habit. I stood in my kitchen with the papers spread across the table, coffee going cold beside them. The house was quiet, the way it always is now. No rush. No reason to hurry. That, I realized, was the danger. When everything goes quiet at once, it's easy to believe the decision has already been made. The form was simple. Too simple for something that would quietly close the longest chapter of my life. A few boxes. A signature line. Language that sounded polite and final. Voluntary retirement. As if anyone ever truly volunteers when the alternatives keep narrowing. I told myself this was reasonable. Sensible. A clean ending. No conflict. No more meetings where my name might appear in red. No more adjusting to a role that no longer felt like mine. I could take what was left with dignity and step aside. That was the story I was trying to sell myself. But even as I held the pen, something felt off. Not dramatic. Just unfinished. Like walking out of a room before the conversation had ended. I folded the paper and put it back in the envelope. Not a decision. Just a delay. Sometimes delay is the only form of control you have left. Work that day felt different. Not heavier, emptier. People were polite. Careful. As if word had already started circulating. That's how it happens. Not through announcements, but through tone. Through glances that linger half a second too long. I kept my distance. Focused on tasks that no one else wanted to touch. The quiet problems. The ones that didn't make it into reports. It gave me something solid to hold onto while everything else felt provisional. In the afternoon, she asked if I could step out for coffee. Not the office cafe. Across the street. A neutral place. That alone told me this wasn't about paperwork. We sat near the window. The place smelled like burnt espresso and lemon cleaner. She didn't open with policy. She didn't mention charts or timelines. Instead, she said, I saw the retirement packet get generated. I didn't deny it. For a moment, she continued, I thought maybe that was what you wanted. I looked at the table, at a thin crack in the wood running from one edge to the other. I thought it might be easier, I said. And it was the truth. Easier than waiting. Easier than being measured. She nodded slowly. My father thought the same thing. She hadn't spoken much about him before. Not like this. He told himself it was his decision, she said. He signed before anyone asked him to. He wanted to leave while he still recognized himself. She paused. He spent the next year trying to figure out who that was without the job. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. I could hear the ending in her voice. I'm not trying to keep you here, she said carefully. I just don't want you to feel rushed into disappearing. That word stayed with me. Disappearing. It wasn't about leaving. It was about how quietly it could happen if you let it. Here was my next real choice. I could thank her, keep things professional, and go back to letting the system carry me forward. Or I could be honest in a way that left no room for retreat. I don't want to stay out of fear, I said. And I don't want to go out of exhaustion. She listened. Really listened. Not as a manager. As someone who understood that timing matters as much as outcome. We talked about options that weren't neat. Adjusting the mentoring structure. Formalizing time for health appointments instead of treating them as inconveniences. Making the transition visible instead of quiet. None of it was guaranteed. All of it would require effort from both of us. When we stood to leave, nothing was resolved. But something had shifted again. This time inward. That evening, at home, I took the retirement form out once more. I read it slowly. I imagined signing it and waking up the next morning with nowhere to be. No rhythm. No unfinished conversations. I put it back. Not because I was afraid to leave, but because I wasn't ready to let the decision happen without me fully in it. The truth is, distance can look like acceptance. Silence can look like peace. But sometimes, they're just ways of avoiding one last necessary stand. As I turned out the light, I understood something clearly. This wasn't the end yet. It was the moment before it, the one where you decide whether you're stepping forward or quietly stepping aside. The last decision didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no dramatic meeting, no final warning, just a quiet morning when I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I was walking through the parking lot earlier than usual, the sky still pale, the building half asleep. For years, I'd arrived with a sense of obligation. That morning, it felt different. Not lighter, clearer. As if something inside me had finally lined up with the direction things were moving anyway. At our age, clarity doesn't come from winning. It comes from stopping the internal argument. I'd spent weeks weighing every option. Stay longer and keep adjusting. Leave now and protect what was left of my energy. Or do something in between that didn't fit neatly into anyone's system but felt honest to me. That morning, I knew which one I was choosing. Later that day, she and I sat down again. No folder this time. No careful setup. We both knew what the conversation was for, and that made it easier in a strange way. When you stop pretending, you don't need as many words. I've thought about your proposal, she said, and about what you said last time. I nodded. I didn't interrupt. Not out of caution this time, but out of respect. We talked plainly about timelines that made sense for my body, not just the company calendar. About what knowledge actually needed to be passed on, and what could be let go without guilt. About setting an end date that wasn't a threat, but a plan. 9 months. Maybe 12. Enough time to do it right. There were no promises of restored hours or reverse decisions. I hadn't expected that. This wasn't a negotiation for status. It was a conversation about control. I want to leave while I still recognize myself, I told her. And I want to leave something behind that isn't just an empty chair. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She didn't dress it up as loyalty or legacy. She just said, then we should put that in writing, on your terms. That phrase stayed with me. On your terms. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't romantic. But it was rare. When the plan was finalized, it felt strangely modest. Reduced hours. Defined responsibilities. Protected time for health and life outside the building. A clear end point, written down instead of whispered about. Nothing that would impress anyone who measured success in titles. But it was mine. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. I worked alongside younger engineers instead of standing in front of them. Showed them things that didn't exist in manuals. Explained why certain shortcuts always came back to cost more in the end. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they didn't. That was fine. Teaching isn't about control. It's about offering. One afternoon, one of them stopped me in the hallway and said, "That thing you showed me last week? It saved us a shutdown." He said it casually, already halfway past me. No ceremony. No announcement. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting that land. Not as validation, but as confirmation. I still had something to give. And I didn't need to prove it anymore. In the evenings, I started leaving earlier. Walking instead of driving when the weather allowed. Sitting with a cup of coffee and no immediate place to be. At first, the space felt uncomfortable. Then it began to feel earned. She and I talked less often as time went on. Not because anything was wrong, but because the work was doing what it was meant to do. Once, as we passed each other near the entrance, she said quietly, "I'm glad you didn't disappear." So was I. The day I finally cleared out my desk, there was no audience. I packed slowly, threw away things I'd kept longer than necessary, took a few items home that no one else would understand the value of. I left the badge on the table, right where it belonged. Walking out, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel sad either. I felt complete. If you're listening to this and you're standing near a similar edge, here's the truth I learned too late and just in time. Leaving doesn't have to mean losing. Staying doesn't have to mean surrendering. What matters is choosing, before silence chooses for you. That morning, as I walked through a small park near my house, instead of heading straight to work, I realized something simple. The word retirement no longer sounded like an ending. It sounded like a chapter one was stepping into with my eyes open. And for the first time in a long while, that felt enough.